do a disclaimer that not in my best shape. I woke up yesterday with a throat ache and headache, and obviously I did a test and it was negative, but who knows? So I'm going to try to keep up the energy, but bear with me if I'm not feeling as well as I would like to. But I didn't want to deceive the audience, that people signed up to the meetup. So I'm going to talk about remote first team interactions with Team Topologies. We're not going to go very deep, let's say, into the Team Topologies book itself. What we're looking at is what are some of the useful approaches and techniques that we talk about in the book that was co-written by me and Matthew Skelton, came out about 2.5 years ago. Which of these techniques are particularly helpful and maybe good starting points if we're having some issues with our remote interactions between teams? I always like to have this quote because this is how I think of Team Topologies, just a set of tools and kind of building blocks to think about what should be our operating model and how to evolve it over time, right? So I don't tend to think of it about as a framework or a methodology, but some people call it that. It's also okay. But this is how I see it, right? So we're using these building blocks with team types, interaction modes, team API, and all these other things to actually build up what can be useful operating model for our organization today, and then how to evolve it over time. So this talk in particular is then about remote team interactions. So there's a workbook that is coming. It has been published already, but it's only available at the moment through the IT Revolution, the publisher of the books, through their app, because of problems with paper and printing, because of the whole supply chain, etc. So all the versions of the book, Kindle and paper version, etc., coming out end of April. So a little bit later. If you're really interested, you can get it on the IT Revolution website and look at find their app. So why are we talking about remote work? And now that many organizations are looking for kind of the sweet spot of, do we work remotely? Do we do some hybrid approach that people have to be in the office for some days of the week or what have you? One thing that should be clear by now, but in some organizations maybe not, that the tooling is just the first step, right? Obviously, Zoom and Slack benefited a lot from the move to remote. But for people who have been in this kind of situation, that maybe you were in the office and then suddenly or quite quickly you became kind of remote workers, you understand that there are a lot of issues around how to set this up properly. It's not just having some tools and working. It's also, in general, easier for one team to find out good ways of working remotely, internally in the team, because we tend to be in direct contact maybe every day, and well, either we use Slack or we use Zoom for some calls, etc. What tends to be difficult and where we need to think about how do we set up communications and interaction modes is when we're talking about multiple teams working remotely, right? And so to be effective at remote work is not just tools, but also how do we ensure also psychological safety, that people feel safe to comment and to communicate with other teams that they need to work with. So if, let's say, we have a ginormous Slack with hundreds of people, maybe some people are not going to feel very safe to put a question on some channel because they're going to be worried that other people think they don't know stuff that they should know, right? These kind of things we need to be careful about, and obviously having some ground rules and practices around for each team and between teams for things like what are working hours, what are response times, if we're providing a service to another team, how do we prefer to communicate with other teams, etc. And organizations that just try to mimic the workplace environment in the office into the remote tools often have found it very difficult to keep up any kind of transformation. You can insert here whatever you want, DevOps transformation or digital transformation. So there's an impact also on our ability to move forward, which is any transformation is already difficult. And if we're in a remote environment without clear kind of ground rules and psychological safety, etc., it's going to be even more painful. So I'm going to talk about a few techniques that you can use and things to think about. Consider the team dependencies. So in Team Topologies, we say there's never, or as far as my experience goes, I haven't seen teams that are fully independent, right? There's always some dependencies on other teams. And that's okay, because that's the nature of complex knowledge work. But we can start to dig in and see which dependencies are healthy, which are maybe not as healthy, so we need to address those. So in a remote first context, it's vital to understand who is working on what, right? We might depend on a platform team, or we might depend on another team to produce some new version of a component or what have you. And so if we don't have an easy way to understand who is working on what and when is it meant to be ready, then it's going to be very difficult. We can use Team API. So we talk about the idea of a Team API in the book, where obviously API is an application programming interface for some service. If we apply this idea to teams, essentially thinking what is the interface of this team with a focus outwards, right? It's not focused on internally how the team works together, but what are the things that other teams need to know about us? And this should be artifact or whatever format you have that evolves on a regular basis as we understand and we detect that there are new challenges or new issues that maybe some team didn't know how to contact us, or they used the wrong channels or what have you. And so we take that input to evolve our Team API to make it easier for the next time, for the next teams. And so from our perspective, we think for effective team first ownership of software teams, we need to have this API and continuously evolve it, advertise, and make it work for the other teams. Again, many people ask, what is the difference between a team API and a team working agreement? Is that the working agreement tends to be internally, which how do we work internally? And team API is what is our interface to the outside world, to the other teams. So team API might have a number of different pieces of information, which especially if we are a team that's developing some software service, which artifacts do we own, what is the versioning approach, etc. Which principles do we do TDD, or do we do code reviews? Do we allow inner sourcing? Do we allow other teams to propose changes to our service, and all these kind of things? In particular, for remote context, making the roadmap of our team visible and the priorities visible to everyone else in an easy way is one of the key aspects to consider, as well as how do we prefer to communicate, right? So the team can decide, and they should decide, if they like to use Slack, or they like maybe in some situations that people call them directly. Whatever the team thinks is a good approach, so they can meet the demand of other teams, then we can publicize that in the Team API. You don't have to call it Team API. Obviously, if you can call it something else. There's just one concept that one definition that we used in the book. So we actually have a template that is just a starting point that you can have a look. We have many kind of small tools and templates on GitHub/Team Topologies, and they're all Creative Commons, so you can just use them without any problem. And so our Team API is going to have whatever information we think is useful for other teams, and then evolve over time as we realize, actually, this aspect here was not clear in the Team API. That's something that other teams need to know about us. And in terms of dependencies between teams, we can also use, again, there's a very simple template on GitHub/Team Topologies. As I was saying before, ideally, each team is tracking their dependencies on other teams, right? Because there will be different types of dependencies. Some will be healthy, so will be okay. They don't really stop us from delivering the value. But there might be other dependencies that are blocking us, meaning there might be some handover of work where if we're working on some feature, for example, we have to stop we have to wait, for example, for the test team to test the feature, or we have to wait for infrastructure to create some resources. So any kind of those dependencies where we have to stop, there's a handover of work outside the team, is a blocking dependency. And so those should be the ones we should try to start to address first if we want fast flow, if we want to have teams that are more independent and able to work on their service without having to stop frequently. And you might have other dependencies that are slowing us down sometimes, but they're still not very painful. And the key thing is then we can look over time how this is evolving, right? So we can take some actions to try to remove some blocking dependencies. And we should also be aware that some healthy dependencies might evolve for whatever reason and become blocking or slowing, right? Maybe the organization has introduced some new process where now we depend on another team in this process. And so something that used to be a healthy dependency now becomes a blocking, for example. So this is quite helpful, again, in a remote context, in any context, because we're talking about fast flow, we're talking about teams having more end-to-end ownership of a service, right? But in remote, where we have challenges of communication interactions, that's also kind of an added value, right? That we have teams that are more independent, don't need to interact as often with other teams. There are other ways that you can track work. So there's a book called Making Work Visible, which is quite good, from Dominica de Grandes. If you might do the dependency tracking on the actual boards of the teams, and other ideas that she has. So it doesn't have to be like this, but this is a very simple approach. Of course, what's important is for the team to understand why is this helpful, why should we spend some effort, which shouldn't be too much, but we should be looking at this on some sort of regular basis, whether that's during our retrospectives or some other ceremony where we go and look at this. So in summary, we want to eliminate, if possible, blocking dependencies, mitigate slow dependencies, and keep healthy dependencies until they become unhealthy, right? We're not going to focus our effort on reducing dependencies that don't really block us or slow us down. And then we want to look at what are the boundaries of teams and groups of teams, right? So in Team Topologies, we talk about trust boundaries. So there's different levels of trust depending on the size of the group that you are part of. Probably several people are familiar with the work of Robin Dunbar. So now when we talk about Dunbar's number, we're talking about there's a natural human limit of our social networks, which applies to the work environment as well. And so usually between 100 to 200 individuals is the number that we can keep meaningful relationships. And so in general, we talk about 150 as the average, but it's really a kind of a spectrum. So what this means is that when we are put in a group, for example, we are in a Slack group, a Slack workspace, where we have hundreds or thousands of people, it's going to be hard to understand who is in our kind of network, where can I find them, and who is outside our kind of social network, right? So it becomes confusing, becomes difficult to navigate and communicate with the right teams. So some organizations have used these limits, for example, to organize their let's say business units or departments so that they don't exceed the 150 to 200 number of people, right? So that we know in this unit or department that needs to work, needs to understand each other, needs to work for the same purpose, that there is a decent level of trust. There's some interesting, the research from Robin Dunbar, as well as other people like Ben Ford, who has a military background and now he works as a software contractor, I think, and he had a post where he was talking about social inflection points, so points where when we're put in a larger group, the trust levels and the way we behave starts to change, right? So we should be aware of that, especially, well, I would say always, but if we're in a remote context, this becomes even more important. So I won't go into details here, but these are the trust boundaries that Robin Dunbar talks about. So we can use that to think about how does our organization match with these trust boundaries. And like I said, the dynamics are going to change when we cross different boundaries. So we shouldn't expect people to continue to behave in the same way if we're growing. For example, I was just talking to a client today kind of scale up. They're expecting to grow from 40 people in product development to 200 by the end of the year. So you can't just hire people and create new teams and expect that everything's going to stay the same, right? There's an interesting example from the book from the physical world. I'm sure a lot of people who are in the UK are familiar with AutoTrader. They have really interesting approaches. And when they moved to this new office, obviously years ago, they actually organized each floor with the teams that belong to the same kind of business unit or value stream in their case, so that you had teams closely related sitting on the same floor. So you had engineering teams, you had marketing teams for example, commercial car sales. They were sitting on the same floor. And they even had some interesting side effects where marketing teams started using Kanban boards and things like that just from the interaction. So we're facilitating the right kind of communication channels between the teams that are closely related. So how does this translate to a remote world? Well, like I said, maybe a huge Slack or whatever Teams or some other tool where you have hundreds or thousands of people, this is going to be very difficult to navigate and promote the trust levels, right? So a simple example could be, if we're looking at the AutoTrader, maybe we actually want different workspaces for different groups within the organization, right? We're not optimizing for cost or for the license, because that cost is really negligible if we compare to the cost of teams and people not finding the right information, not being able to interact in a better way. And so maybe we would have, in the AutoTrader example, I'm not saying this is what they did, but maybe we would, on a virtual world, also have different workspaces for the different business units. And then we can have other kind of ground rules around how we name the Slack channels. That's also something very common, that you start to see channels popping up with all sorts of names that whoever created thought was a good name, but there's no kind of ground rule on how is this easy to discover by other teams or not, right? So we go back to the team API, but also thinking what are some team-focused conventions, right? And this is some examples, doesn't mean this is what you need to do, but in this example, what we're saying, each team probably needs their own channel. If we have a stream team 1, a platform team, etc., we might have some channels for specific interactions where we might say, well, stream team 1 and the platform team are working on some new version of the monitoring service or some new use case or something like that. So we know this is the channel where that interaction is going to happen, unless the teams decide to do it in another way. But so we're always thinking about how do we facilitate discovering and navigating the virtual spaces. And then obviously individual people should have their name and photo and their role and team, so it's easy for others to understand who they're talking to. So whatever it is that we think is useful, but we should think about what are some conventions that are focused on teams that are going to help us people navigate, reduce the noise in this remote workspaces. So these conventions help increase discoverability and reduce also the cognitive load on teams around communications, right? If we're having to think about, well, wait a second, which channel does team X use, or are they okay with asking questions in that channel or not? That's also actually costing us effort from our point of view on understanding how to communicate with the other team. So again, the team API is going to help a lot, as well as having some ground rules and team-focused conventions on the workspaces. We should aim to have purposeful interactions. So there's this kind of myth, and certainly DevOps to some extent, for all the good that it brought. It also, in some organizations, there's kind of a bit naive in understanding that, well, if we just have every team open to collaborate with other teams, then we're going to be in a better place. But it's actually costly for a team to have to frequently collaborate with others. So we should understand why we're collaborating, for how long are we collaborating, and when do we know if the collaboration should be finished. So we should not expect that everyone needs to talk with everyone else or every other team to do their kind of regular work. So having well-defined interactions is going to help even more in a remote context, but in any kind of context. So we talk about 3 types of interaction modes in Team Topologies. Very briefly, like I said, collaboration, 2 teams working together on a specific problem or specific solution, whether it's a new API or some change in some service that the teams need to collaborate to understand what they need to do for a defined period of time, or they're working on some new practices on how they're going to set up this new practice, etc. Facilitating, the last one, is where one team helps another kind of gain and bridge some capability gaps and learn about some domain in a much kind of targeted way. Obviously, we have communities of practice, and we should keep those. You might have centers of excellence, for example, and those can bring value, but the knowledge sharing is much more tends to be much more diffuse, right? We're not targeting specific teams' needs, and so that's where facilitating is different. We identify this team has a gap in, let's say, their design skills, and so they're not able to do some basic design approach for their application, and so they might need help from another team, but it can be anything. And X as a service is typical for platform teams. So in the same way that we have infrastructure as a service, or we have cloud providers, etc., we apply this internally to our platform teams that are building services that are, let's say, customized, have the right abstractions for our internal teams, right? So we start to be able to look at kind of at least part of the organization in this way, that we understand what are the interactions happening, what are the interactions expected to happen in the future, because we have another challenge coming next. So again, the Team API can help, and we can include the interaction, the expected interactions in the Team API. We can do it somewhere else, but again, making it visible to both teams can be helpful. Where one teams, we might have something like this as an example. We are facilitating, we are being facilitated by a test automation enabling team. We are collaborating with a monitoring and telemetry platform team with some specific purpose, with a specific duration, right? So we make it visible to everyone. And you might detect some misunderstandings where maybe the test automation enabling team expected the interaction to happen in a different way. And so it's a good also kind of sensing mechanism. And when the interactions are happening, sometimes there's awkwardness because we had different expectations for what we were doing together, or it took much longer than we expected. And so we can use those things that might happen as kind of, again, inputs to what happened here. Maybe it can be anything. Maybe one of the teams doesn't have the knowledge that they would need to collaborate on this area. And so they need to learn and be facilitated before we can actually discuss how we evolve some, let's say, monitoring service. So we use that as sensing, as input. We want to clarify communication purpose and channels, obviously with the Team API, and specifically for platform teams, that tends to be a lot of different inputs coming into a platform team. You might have, so first of all, you want to make sure you have the right information in the platform wiki or the platform team API, if you want to call it that, where we provide information about our services, what are response times, etc. But then specifically in the context of remote, you want to have communication channels that are very clear, right? So platform teams are usually often overloaded with demand from other teams, whether it's a request for help, whether it's communicating an incident, some problem in some service, or a service doesn't meet the needs of some team. And so for the platform team, it's probably going to be important to clarify, maybe if there's an incident with a platform service, we want to respond very quickly. So use a specific Slack channel or call us. And for other things, for feedback and support, use these other channels, right? Whatever the platform team decides, we make that visible to everyone else. And last but not least, we need to, and certainly I would expect and hope by now many organizations have sort of embedded this into their remote ways of working, is to get feedback from teams, feedback from the interactions, etc. Right? So we need to think, like I said in the beginning, about psychological safety, so people feel like they can provide constructive feedback. But as you probably now realize from my talk, there's a lot which is kind of sensing for evolution, understanding signals that something needs to evolve. So we set up kind of the ground rules. We want to set up some team focus conventions and all these things, team dependencies tracking. But then as we go, we understand and we look at what are signals and feedback around, well, actually, this interaction didn't go well. Why is it? Or we couldn't find the information about this service. So it seems like your API is not complete, but you need to think about how to make this a normal thing and an ongoing thing. And finally, and especially for platform teams, think about getting feedback from our internal teams about how does the platform help or hinder the work of the stream-aligned teams in particular, right? So from Team Topologies' perspective, the platform exists to reduce cognitive load on the stream-aligned teams so they can go faster and do things in their life cycle of their service in an easier way with the right abstractions, etc. So if we're in a platform team, probably we want to think about how we're going to get feedback from users if they're happy or not with the platform. So this is an example from Twilio. There's a really nice presentation that you have a link there where they do this. I think every quarter they send out this sort of survey. How well does the platform help the teams build, deploy, deliver, run? Is the platform compelling? Do we listen to your feedback and your problems and make improvements? So that's also something we should, I would say, in any environment, try to have in place, but especially remotely. Just some resources to end the presentation. If you want to, we have some infographics on how to get started, what is Team Topologies in a nutshell, which are good to share with other people who might not have experience or know about Team Topologies. There are a number of resources. So I mentioned the GitHub repositories as well, but on our site, there's a lot of tools as well. It's very simple tools to do things like what we saw today and other resources. And we have an academy since last year where we're trying to create courses that video-based training that bring in what are insights since the book came out, right? So even the Team Topologies distilled is the basic ideas or the key ideas in the book, plus things that we discovered as we helped different customers, and then other more specific things like what is platform as a product, etc. There's a common question, maybe some of you have the question, how do we assess team cognitive load? In fact, the book took the cognitive load definition from the psychology, from cognitive load theory, and what we're doing this year, we hope to have something working before the end of the year. We're working with also people who have psychology plus software delivery understanding, doing some research on some helpful tools to start assessing team cognitive load on a more kind of structured way, which we've seen that many organizations would like to have that. And that's it. So we have plenty of time for questions.
Thank you very much, Manuel. That was really insightful and really helpful. So guys, questions, feel free to unmute and ask your question, use the raise hand feature in Jira or use the chat system, whichever medium you prefer. Okay, Jill, you have your hand up. Please go for it.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'll start with something simple or seemingly simple. At my company, due to bandwidth issues, when we started working remote, they told people not to use their video cameras in meetings. But technology has improved and now we can, but many people are still not opening their cameras. And I try to lead by example and keep mine open, but I don't know, it also depends on the UI. We use Teams. You know, if you're the only one with the camera open, you're taking up the whole real estate, and that's not good either. Yeah. So I'd love to hear your thoughts or ideas of how to, you know, gently encourage people to turn on their cameras.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, it feels more kind of interactive if you can see people's faces. But at the same time, you want to balance that with kind of the psychological safety. People maybe don't feel comfortable to put a camera because they're working in their living room and maybe their kids are walking around. And so I would try, to clarify, first of all, is this still a technical issue? Do people not have, good enough bandwidth connection? Then fix that. And then this might require some work of, kind of one-to-one talking to people, understanding, is that a problem? Do you feel not safe to share your camera? And then for a specific meeting or session, you can sort of in advance talk to people and see if they're gonna turn on their camera or not. So people also react a lot by even though you're giving the example, if it's only one, they will maybe copy the other example, the rest of the people, right?
Okay. Thank you. It's not easy, but no.
I've had some training sessions where almost everyone had the camera off. It's it's hard.
It is.
Like you don't see who you're talking to, and so that for as humans, that makes it harder to relate to that person. Obviously.
Thank you.
There's a very good, by the way, a very good newsletter on psychological safety that I can try to find from Tom Geraghty. I don't know how to pronounce his name, which comes out, I think, every week. I can try to find the link, but he has been putting out that newsletter on a regular basis. It has a lot of tips and ideas how to promote that.
Just to add to that, something I've done recently is if you have the time to demonstrate the difference in the quality of communication, you could run exercises to demonstrate the effectiveness of how you talk to another human being while looking at them and while not looking at them. And, you multiple ways to run that, but you essentially play out a couple scenarios, and usually it's quite obvious that the scenario where people can see each other is where the quality of the conversation is greater. They have more empathy for someone because they can see them. So if you have the time and space, you could also run a little exercise and, create that learning to demonstrate the value of seeing people. Okay, awesome. Thank you very much for the question and answer. Mary, you've been waiting patiently with your hand up. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
No worry. I just wanted to say I really love the team API piece. I just love that whole concept of, putting it out there and having it available to people, and them knowing where to go and exactly where you stand. So not a question, just that I really love that concept.
Thank you. Yeah, it's very simple, right? It's just the perspective is different, that we're looking at what other teams outside of our world as a team, what they need. We weren't sure if API was going to be too technical term because we have engineering background, but it's basically the team interface, right? The team interface is what we're talking about.
Yeah. I love that.
Thank you.
Okay, lovely just to see a comment with some praise. Thank you, Mary. Tiago, would you like to ask your question or provide your comment?
Yeah, so I'm following on Mary's comment. So thanks, Manuel, for the session. And I'll have a question around the team API. You mentioned the interactions, and we talked, the examples we gave were from technical teams. Would you also have on the interactions teams like marketing, sales planning, and this kind of other beyond product technology? You shouldn't be mapping them, is the suggestion.
I think that would be helpful. So from our point of view, the book is focused on technology teams, where we start to see adoption of some of these ideas outside of technology. There's a really good example that is actually one organization, if you remember GDPR, the privacy regulations in the European Union a few years ago. Many organizations were struggling. They were running around trying to understand what's the impact. And some organizations, what they did is realized, this has direct impact on a lot of the technical aspects, how we store data, how we retrieve, how we organize, etc. And because the regulations were very, legalese, they had a team, an enabling team of people who were experts in GDPR, who were coming to the development teams to help them understand what is the real, kind of distill the regulations to what do you need to do. You need to make sure you can, delete this data, that you don't record certain data without permission, etc. And so that's, I think, a really good example. But we have also heard about examples with marketing teams, even organizations creating a sort of marketing platform where a marketing team used to be directly having to do part of the work of the delivering some new release, obviously. And now there's some sort of platform service that helps the teams kind of do some things by themselves. If it's not a huge new release, a new product, but if it's something small, they can do it by themselves. So we're starting to see that application outside of technology.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Thank you.
Great. Any other questions, people? Hands up. Feel free to unmute. Danica. Danica, please.
Yeah.
Yep.
Although if you're Eastern European, you could say Danica. I'm in North America.
Thank you for the correction.
Oh, no, Danica is how I'm in North America, so that's what we roll with, but I know it's very European here. Here's what I'm wondering, and I am going to buy your book. In fact, I already sent it to my client. And to Tiago's question, and if you want to reach out to me, I'm actually working with a performance art company, and I'm working with their digital teams, their marketing, their PR. So it's pretty interesting bringing in Agnostic Agile to these groups. So I'm getting some pretty deep experience over the last year. But my question is, with this team, with this client, some things that are hard in other groups, like cross-functional teams, are very easy with them. Some things that are really easy with, IT Agile is really hard. And so, Manuel, obviously I haven't read your book yet, but is there stuff in there about just how to start? And I'll give you one example. I'm trying to get them to do a roadmap. And so what did they use? They used Excel. Oh, yes. And they did every month of, like, you have to scroll on your screen. So basically they did a sprint backlog of all the tasks for every month. It was a ton of work. It's Excel, and it's not the kind of, just a Miro board, like just by quarters. So I gave them an example of just chunks, like you have this performance, or you have this project, or you have this mentoring program for young artists, just a color stream. Yeah. And that's with one team. And then what I wanted to do was then say, okay, here's your roadmap, right? And then here's the roadmap for one of the other groups, and kind of overlay them. So it's really like, if I understand correctly, it's Team Topologies with what you're suggesting. How do you start in a way that they've over-engineered and overcomplicated?
Well, that's unfortunately it's common sometimes. I would try to, obviously with Agile, and in the book in Team Topologies, we specifically don't recommend or talk too much about if teams should use Scrum or what have you, or Kanban, because we think the team should have the power to decide what's going to be helpful, as long as they keep that interface with the other teams. And obviously with Agile, you in general, you want to break down things so that you're not doing a 6-month plan where after 1 month we're already behind and the priorities are not really validated. And so I'm not sure I have maybe other people on the call have better techniques to address that. But just, I think like Nabil was saying earlier, sort of try and experiment if you can, and have one team work in smaller batches and kind of not have that huge spreadsheet. Using spreadsheet is not the problem, right? But having this huge roadmap for months then we expect to be immutable, and we'll just have this fallacy that it would just execute on the roadmap and everything will be fine. And I think that's where Agile also came in to say, that doesn't really work very well. So maybe try with one team that is willing to work on a more kind of course, you're going to need a team, you're going to need kind of the business owners, depending how the team is organized, to put in the accept that we're going to do things a bit differently. And then if you can show the value that we're able to adapt much faster and focus on the outcomes and not on the roadmap itself, the roadmap should be a tool for us to look at, what do we think we need to do to achieve some outcomes. So we shouldn't be focused on, the goal should not be to execute the roadmap, should be to meet some outcomes, right? But it's interesting you mentioned applying this to a very different kind of company. Another interesting example of applying team topologies outside technology, or not just in technology, was actually when the UK was rolling out the vaccination for COVID, the vaccination program, and all the services around that. They actually used kind of specifically interaction modes, the collaboration between the software teams and the doctors and the people who knew what needed to happen. So that was there's actually a very interesting talk about that.
That sounds like a fascinating talk. Maybe you could share the link if you have it handy.
Yeah, I can try to find it.
That'd be awesome. Thank you very much for the question and answer. Totally agree with Manuel's response. Find that pilot team, try out, experiment with a new way of working, and we've got some success stories. It helps if that team is as vertically sliced as possible. So all the people within the organization from the different levels who need to be involved in order for the experiment to be as complete as possible. That also helps, rather than it just being like, a specific team that don't have the authority to make certain decisions, that you need to see agility. So that would be my only contribution to that. But any other questions we have, people? Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Because I'm trying to buy the book, Team Topologies, because I'm trying to explore how he has mentioned the different levels of the teams and so on. I just have a question for him because I'm about to order it in Amazon now. The question is this also a kind of levels of teams or team members mentioned, for example, like who can be a product owner, who can be a value stream identifier, who can be a senior product owner, who can be a product manager or the portfolio manager. Is this also mentioned there?
No, we don't cover that. Like I said, we specifically wanted to leave kind of the composition of teams and the kind of so we wanted to focus on the teams, and from the types of teams you can sort of derive and understand what kind of capabilities they probably need. So when we're talking about stream-aligned teams that have end-to-end ownership of a service, they're going to need to have some capabilities around design, for example, around product management, and then how that translates into, do we have a specific person who is product manager, or do we just have the team kind of have the knowledge to do that? It depends on each organization, because what we're looking at, what capabilities does the team need? For example, for platform teams, that's something that's typically missing, because if we're talking about platform as a set of services to reduce the effort from stream-aligned teams, that's a different perspective from focusing on what is the technology that we can build in the platform, or we should build. It's what is going to be helpful for our internal teams. And so from that perspective, you probably need someone with a product management role inside the platform, for example. You probably need some help from user experience for the teams in the platform, so they can learn those things and be able to provide a service in this sense of something that reduces the load on the stream-aligned teams. So we don't prescribe specific roles or specific methodologies inside the teams. What we're saying is what kind of capabilities we are expecting them to have, depending on their sort of mission as a team.
Thanks a lot.
Great, thank you. Gerhard, I noticed you wrote a question in the chat. Would you like to unmute and ask your question? If not, I can ask it on your behalf. Cool. So Gerhard's question was, are team APIs similar to doing a strategic domain-driven design with context mappings?
Not really. So you would expect to have, if we're talking about the value streams, understanding what is the value we're providing to customers so that we can align teams to those value streams. You might use something like context mapping, domain-driven design. We actually have a very simple tool on GitHub called independent service heuristics, just a set of questions to try to figure out if this service is expected that we think is going to be mostly independent and provide value to customers. That sort of is something that you probably need to do separately from the team APIs, right? You can start with the team APIs right now. Any team can sort of create this artifact to show to other teams what are we working on, what are, how do we like to communicate, etc. But the context mapping or using independent service heuristics is something that's going to help you to identify what are the streams of value to customers that we want to align our teams to, so they can have end-to-end ownership of one of those streams.
Great, thank you for that. Hopefully it answers Jihad's question. Audience, any other questions, comments? Feel free to raise your hand or unmute and ask a question.
By the way, there was another question from Segun Eros in the chat, which I think relates to the previous one in a way, asking in the context of scale agile, where teams can be in excess of 150, how do we break this down or manage? And that relates again to identifying the value streams that can be, so breaking down sort of our overall business, where often you have a sort of monolith, not just on a technical level, but actually on a business level, where we added all sorts of functionality to this large system, and we don't really understand what are the independent streams or services. So we can use those techniques, the domain-driven design or the independent service heuristics, to kind of break those down and try to get groups of teams that are no bigger than 150. I don't know if there's a reference here to SAFe, and I don't want to, well, I do want to criticize SAFe in the sense that it can be helpful depending on your starting point, but at some point SAFe starts to, from my perspective, starts to manage dependencies. They're not really breaking the dependencies, right? And so you might get into that situation where we're growing, we're having more teams, and we're trying to manage with process, right? With release trains and all these things, PI planning, etc. And so that might be helpful if you're in a very chaotic situation to start with no predictability, no kind of releases going on a regular basis. But at some point, we are actually managing dependencies and not breaking dependencies. So we are limited to kind of how fast we can go with some frameworks like SAFe. And so, maybe it's a trade-off or decision that ideally is made in a constant way, right? Not just using SAFe because other organizations say SAFe is good.
Great insight. Thank you very much for that. Any other questions? Shotaro, you just asked yours in the chat. Would you like to unmute and ask? Otherwise, we can read it out. Okay, so in terms of non-tech projects, what kind of project is most applicable for team topologies and what's not suitable?
That's an interesting question. I don't have a clear answer. What I can tell you is that this is something that's growing, and is something that likely we will focus on in the future, whether it's a new revision of the book or even a new short book. But I'm looking for a presentation that, if I can find it. So just to mention what is possible, one consulting company in Norway actually tried to apply team topologies to their whole organization, right? So they're not huge, but they have sales team, leadership team, they have legal team, etc. And what they did is try to map those teams into the 4 types of teams in team topologies, understand how that's going to help them clarify how teams interact. So I can try. So I gave them some feedback. We did a sort of meetup session talking about what their approach, and they're also learning what works well, what doesn't work well when we're applying these patterns outside of technology. But in my mind, there are many aspects that could be benefit from applying these ideas, especially thinking, should we be a sort of platform team? For example, HR or sales, should they be focusing on providing helpful services in whatever way? Maybe they're not they're not there's some Excel sheets or something that teams can then use and do by themselves, right? So I think I have the link. It's actually it's in Norwegian, but you can translate to, let me share for a second. And then we probably need to stop, but they have this article originally in Norwegian where they talk about how they use team topologies across the organization. So if you look at this sort of diagram, these colors correspond to types of teams in team topologies. The yellow are streamlined teams, the purple are enabling teams, the blue are platform teams. So they even look at marketing as a sort of platform team that is helping provide useful services for their other teams to do the marketing part of their job in an easier way. So I think there's a lot we're going to see in terms of application of this more broadly, but it's early days.
It's fascinating. Thank you for sharing. Really interesting stuff. Helano, you've had your hand up. Would you like to unmute and ask a question?
Hello, Manuel. I'm a really fan of your work and the work of Manuel Skelton. I believe that we in IT are really creating great new concepts, and some of them are really important for us to grow. This February, Hurricane Apple for Management 3.0 created an unfixed model for org design. And he mentioned the work from Team Topologies as a base for his work. Do you know a little bit the difference of this new org design model, or do you know the connections between the work of Hurricane Apple?
Yes. So for Team Topologies, for us is yes, there's org design aspect, but it's much more about evolutions. How do we evolve the organization? So we're not looking at the specific organizational model or operating model that we want to stick to. We're actually looking at how do we evolve it over time by looking at the inputs from the teams and from other things. His model uses the team topologies types of teams. I'm not sure why there are different names and things. So I don't have enough deep understanding of what he's doing. But I mean, what I can say is team topology is obviously not answer to everything. You need to understand, how do we do product management in an effective way? How do we become a product-oriented organization? There are some books that are closely related. So I would say there's a book called From Project to Product from Mick Kirsten that is very kind of well aligned to what we talk about. And obviously there's Accelerate more at the team level. How do we look at if the team is going in the right direction? So I don't know too much about the unfixed model. I would, because many people said Team Topologies provides a shared vocabulary to talk about teams, interactions, etc. What I wouldn't like to see is just dispersing by adding new terminology. But like I said, I don't have all the details of what he's trying to do. But he did mention that it was based on Team Topology.
Thank you so much. I'm waiting you come to Brazil to sign my book. And thank you for the presentation today.
Yeah, thank you. There's a lot of interest in Brazil. That's really nice, and we can speak in Portuguese when I'm in Brazil.
It is a funny coincidence that you mentioned Jürgen and the unfixed model, because our next meetup in 2 weeks is precisely with Jürgen on the unfixed model. So if you do want to learn a bit more about how Team Topologies inspired it, maybe come along in a couple of weeks. I just sent the link to it in the chat. So that was perfect. Okay, guys, we are at time. So thank you so much, Manuel. This is where I do my virtual round of applause. If anyone wants to unmute and join me, please do. I can see some people doing it. There we go.
Thank you.
It is much.
Thanks for having me.
I promise you. Awesome. Okay, thank you so much.